Welcome everybody, and thank you again for joining us for another Discover Wildlife evening, especially on a Thursday night, first day of the weekend. So for those of you who don't know me, oh hello, I'm Emma Healy. I'm one of the travel consultants for Wildlife Worldwide and the Natural Travel Collection. I know a lot of you already know me, have travelled with me, so hi. And in the other corner over there, we've got Nick Garbutt, who I will introduce a bit more in a minute.
Good evening, everyone.
So tonight we are here to talk about our Festival of Wildlife, which is next April in Tanzania. And this is an exciting one for Nick and I, because I was lucky enough to go over for my first time last April, actually on the same day that we're going next year. So for kind of comparison, if anybody has any questions, do ask. But it's really based in a lodge over in Ndutu, where Nick has been for the last 25 years or so. So there is probably nobody better placed to talk to us about it tonight. So I will let Nick tell you much more. I will be here to answer any questions. Please use either the Q&A function or the chat function. I'll answer whichever ones I can during the talk, and if there are others, or I'll save some and we can have a chat with Nick afterwards. For those of you who don't know Nick, I imagine that's not many of you, Nick is a wonderful photographer who runs a lot of our photography trips, or photography trips with us, and especially a lot of them to the Serengeti, and as I say, has been there multiple times. So without further ado, Nick, I will leave it to you.
Thank you, Emma. Once again, good evening, everyone. As Emma said, I've been traveling to the Serengeti for rather a long time, over 25 years now. I've been visiting on and off, and it still remains one of my favorite places. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a broad introduction to the Serengeti in general, and then a little later in the talk, I will be more specific with respect to Ndutu and so forth. The Northern Tanzania Safari Circuit, of course, is one of the most famous anywhere in Africa. The Serengeti, as you can see here, lies at the heart of that circuit, often incorporating Ngorongoro Crater as well, Lake Manyara, Tarangire National Park, sometimes Arusha National Park, and of course Kilimanjaro, for those that want to climb Kili as well. We're going to be concentrating on the Serengeti portion, which from my perspective is certainly, I think, the most exciting from a wildlife point of view. But your point of access, at least to this part of Tanzania and Africa, is to fly into Kilimanjaro International near Arusha, and then either fly out to the Serengeti or drive out to the Serengeti. So just to hone in a little more on particularly the southern portion of the Serengeti that I'm going to concentrate on. As you can see from this map here, at the very southern southeastern edge of the Serengeti is the Ngorongoro Crater, or the Serengeti area, I should say, which is obviously an upland highland area, and then spreading out north and west of the Ngorongoro Highlands are the Serengeti Plains, some of which fall within the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, some of which, of course, fall within the Serengeti National Park, but they're all part of the broad ecosystem. And that, I'll come back to that, because there are differences between those two protected areas, particularly in terms of the way that you're allowed to visit and access them, that are quite crucial and are very much part and parcel of some of the decisions and choices that have been made with respect to the festival. You can see Ndutu on this map over towards the left-hand side, which actually lies within the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, not the Serengeti National Park. But as I stress, it's part of the Serengeti Plains ecosystem. This, after all, it's just a line on a map. There's no boundary as far as wildlife is concerned. And in a broad sense, the southern part of the Serengeti really encompasses all that is special and memorable about any trip to East Africa. Wonderful combination of grassland and bushland, acacia woodland, wonderful sunrises, as you can see here, which are always a feature of any safari, of course, being out just before the sun rises and often not getting back until close to sunset or just after sunset. So those early parts of the day and the end of the day are often when the most spectacular light occurs. So from a photography perspective, of course, they're when you really want to be out there and making the most of it. I think one of the things that some people who perhaps haven't been to the Serengeti might assume is that it's just grassland, and it's far from just grassland. A lot of the habitat within the broader Serengeti ecosystem is grassland combined with more open woodland, as you can see here. And this is certainly very much a feature of the Ndutu area, which I'll come back to. Of course, the Serengeti is famed for great masses of animal and the migration, which I will come on to shortly. But at times, it is without doubt one of the most spectacular wildlife events you can witness anywhere on the planet, because there is no greater concentration of large mammals to be seen anywhere, whether that be wildebeest, zebra, and a host of other grazing antelope and so forth. This is the Ndutu area, specifically looking back towards the southeast, towards the Ngorongoro Highlands, which you can see in the distance there. And this is Lake Ndutu, which is very much at the heart of the area that we'll be visiting during the Festival of Wildlife next year. But it also just forms a real focal point for wildlife, particularly at the time of year we're going to be talking about. The lake is varies in height. It's a very shallow lake generally, but a good lake to see both lesser and, as you can see here, greater flamingos. It's not a large lake, but there are always flamingos on it. Certainly not a lake like Nakuru or Natron, where colossal concentrations of flamingos occurs, but there are always flamingos to see around Lake Ndutu. As you can see here, greater flamingos, but often larger numbers of lesser flamingos. So just a little bit of background about the famous migration of primarily wildebeest and zebra, but also other grazing animals. It, of course, is an ongoing annual event. I think some people perhaps think it only occurs at certain times of the year. In effect, it's perpetual. So theoretically, and I stress theoretically, you could go to the Serengeti ecosystem and see the migration in some form or other at any time of the year. There are, however, better times to see it because the animals become more or less concentrated at certain times of the year. And generally speaking, the times of the year that are really targeted for seeing the migration in its pomp are during August, September, and early October, when the migration is very much at the northern part of the Serengeti ecosystem and into the Masai Mara in Kenya. And that's where you'll get often the famous river crossings that are often very much sought after in terms of seeing and photographing, whether that be the Mara River on the Kenyan side or the Mara River once it's crossed the border to the south and is actually on the Tanzanian side within the Serengeti. You can visit the northern Serengeti or the Masai Mara at that time and see river crossings on a regular basis, as well as all of the other wildlife that you would associate with this part of Africa. The other prime time to see it, which I'm going to be concentrating on here, is when the herds gather towards the southern part of the Serengeti ecosystem in January, February, March, and April. And this is where they gather to give birth to their calves. Either side of those two periods, when the animals are heading northwards towards the Mara, generally down the western side of the Serengeti through the Garbutt controlled area and the Ikorondo controlled area, it's a less good time to see them because the herds tend to be much more diffuse. And similarly, between November and January, the the herds are passing down the eastern side of the ecosystem through Loliondo, and again, they tend to be much more diffuse, passing through woodlands, so it's not really an ideal time to target. My favorite time, without a doubt, is when the herds are gathering on the southern plains. These are the short grass plains where the grasses are highly nutritious, which is, of course, why the herds gather there. So females are grazing on the most nutritious grass prior to giving birth and while they're suckling their calves. So during January, as you can see here, they're gathering where this red diffuse area is towards the southern part of the Serengeti ecosystem. And this is both in the Serengeti National Park and outside the national park in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And generally speaking, the herds are milling around through January, and you can see here February. These are obviously very broad brush representations. January, February, March, and then into April. 90% of wildebeest calves are born in February. So obviously herds get very concentrated, but exactly where they're concentrated is very much dictated by where the localized rains fall. The grasses are at their most nutritious at this time because, of course, rain is falling, and that then is encouraging the growth, and that's what the animals gather to feed on. So between January, February, March, and then, as this last slide shows, into April, they're milling around this general southern area, and they can be anywhere within that area during that time, and they move back and forth. So it's not a migration that occurs in a single direction. They will move back and forth during this period following localized rains. And that means there are times when, in certain areas, the plains can be almost devoid of wildlife, in fact, completely devoid of wildlife at times. As you can see here, these are some of the short grass plains outside the park, the Serengeti National Park, but just inside the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and just handfuls of wildebeest. But if there is localized rain, this, as you can see, the grass here is very green because there was rain here 2 or 3 days prior to this shot being taken. But wildebeest much further afield would have been aware of that. They can smell the rain, they can see the rain clouds gathering. So plains that are very much empty like this, one day, within 1 or 2 days, can change and can be covered in masses of animals as they migrate into the area. Very much a feature of the way the migration works in this system, that movement is continuous following these rains. So you can very much be in a place where animals aren't there for 1 day, and then literally overnight they will arrive, and you hear them coming. I mean, you can hear them and often smell them as well. If you're downwind, and you can hear the gradual build of sound as they get closer and closer. You wake up in the morning and one day they weren't there, the next day there's lots of them there. And they're often gathering through gullies and woodlands and funneling from all sorts of different directions. If there hasn't been rain for a while, they tend to be quite spread out and the herds are quite diffuse. Then if rain becomes really concentrated in one area, they start flooding in from all points and really gathering intense concentrations where there has been the most recent rain. Which often means you can be suddenly surrounded by tens of thousands of animals. This is an area very close to Ndutu called Long Gully, which anyone who's stayed in and around Ndutu for any length of time will become very familiar with, because it's always generally a funneling point and gathering point for herds, and by default all sorts of other species as well, carnivores and some of the less well-known antelope as well. And it really acts as a sort of gathering point and funneling point. So it's very much a feature of any visit to the Ndutu area. And it can be beautiful in its own right. This was a shot I took really early one morning after a heavy dew, and spiders' webs that hitherto had been invisible because there was no dew hanging on them suddenly became this magical sort of wonderland forest of spider webs. So it's memorable for all sorts of reasons, this particular area, and I'll come back to mentioning it time and again during the talk because it's so good. Obviously, as herds gather, wherever it may be, there are carnivores that move into the area and gather as well. Many of these locations feature resident carnivores that rely on herds passing through for their hunting. Some of them will move over longer distances. Hyenas will move 50, 60, 70, 80 kilometers to follow herds and then go back to where they originated from, where the clan's den and so forth is. But they're always on the lookout. There's often, when there are, of course, calves being born, there is so much opportunity for hunters like hyenas that, although they're renowned for scavenging, will, at this time of year in particular, very much hunt for themselves and always be on the lookout for young wildebeest. This is what they've got here, a young wildebeest that's only a handful of days old. This part of the southern Serengeti is also a magnificent place to see lions. There's an ongoing lion research project which has uncovered some fascinating data with respect to lions and how much they move around the Ndutu area and the broader area within the southern Serengeti. Lions that one day might be in the Ngorongoro crater are 3 or 4 days later 100 kilometers away somewhere else. So the ongoing research is very much opening our eyes to the sorts of migrations that happen within the carnivores following these herds around. Certainly at the time when the wildebeest move into this part of the southern Serengeti, lions from all quarters move in, and the whole dynamic of lion hierarchy becomes very much more fluid. And again, for someone like myself that's been fortunate enough to visit on numerous occasions, seeing the way that that dynamic changes from one year to the next is fascinating. Seeing new lions come in, new lions mature, and so forth. Another carnivore that's possible to see, I certainly would not guarantee it, but is starting to make a comeback in the southern Serengeti, are painted dogs. They unfortunately still do get persecuted by the Maasai, but there are dens that appear from time to time in the southern Serengeti and in the Ngorongoro highlands. So this is a shot that I did take while staying at Ndutu one time. These particular animals had a den that was around 50 kilometers south of Ndutu, but it's always a possibility that you might get lucky and see painted dogs. The woodlands around the southern part of the Serengeti, where it's a mosaic of grassland as well as open acacia woodland, are obviously home to a far greater variety of grazing animals, herds and wildlife. Impala are very common. Hartebeest too, there's a Cook's hartebeest, which are generally seen in the area. And passing through, there'll be large numbers of eland, as well as the smaller antelope that you're likely to see, like Thompson's gazelle and Grant's gazelle, which again you'll see more likely to see on the open plains. But in these mosaics of woodland, there are several other species that will pass through and are encountered on a regular basis. Buffalo too, their distribution is very much more tailored or geared towards where water is available, but nonetheless herds of buffalo will certainly pass through the Ndutu area, particularly when there's been rain. This is a fantastic area for birders. This is a martial eagle that's just predated a guinea fowl, but again, wherever there's a border between woodland and grassland, it's a prime hunting area for raptors, and also really good for all sorts of other birds, pygmy falcons. Birding in East Africa is probably as good or as easy as it ever gets, because there are just so many species to see, and they're often so relatively easy to see. In any one day, you could easily see 70, 80, 90 birds, and that's not being a specialist birder. That's just picking up species because there are so many and they're so readily visible. Eagle owls too, often seen. Smaller carnivores in these areas are things that you can very much look forward to seeing too. Bat-eared foxes are common in and around the southern part of the Serengeti. They're primarily termite feeders, but because there's such a high proportion of grassland with termites that feed on grass roots, there are obviously large concentrations or quantities of bat-eared foxes that target feeding on termites too. Wherever there's grassland, there are rodents, and of course specialist rodent hunters too, like serval, and some other carnivores that you may get lucky to see, particularly at the time of year when the migration is in the area of the southern Serengeti. This is a ratel or honey badger. Certainly couldn't guarantee this, but there are good populations and they're seen from time to time. And of course, other cats. I've mentioned lions already. The woodland areas are excellent for leopards. They're not necessarily the easiest animals to see. We all know leopards are secretive, and these areas, there are lots of trees. So obviously you've got to spend a bit of time or get lucky to find which tree leopards happen to be resting in or sleeping in during the day. But certainly seeing leopards in the acacia woodlands of the southern Serengeti, particularly around Ndutu, is very much a possibility. And I've had certainly some of my best leopard sightings early in the day or late in the day in and around the woodlands of Ndutu. This was one that was a shot that was taken on the last trip I did, which was March, April last year, where we'd actually been lucky enough to find a mum and a cub that were sleeping up a tree, and we waited until the very end of the day, hoping that they'd come down, which they did. What we didn't realize was that the adjacent tree was where they'd actually cached a carcass. So they wandered over to this tree, climbed up it, and lo and behold, there was an impala carcass hanging in the tree that we, prior to then, hadn't even realized was there. As I mentioned, the Ndutu area is especially good for lions, and there are anywhere between 2 and 4 resident prides in and around the Ndutu area. This particular pride, this photo is in the Long Gully area. This was taken in a specific part of Long Gully called Big Marsh, as you can see, a lioness with cubs in marshy areas. And one of the reasons that Ndutu, or the Ndutu area, is so good is that the rules within the Ngorongoro Conservation Area are very different to the rules governing how you are able to visit within the Serengeti National Park. Inside the national park, you are not allowed to leave the official roads and tracks. Inside the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, you can drive off-road anywhere you choose. And that obviously is a game changer when it comes to not only sighting wildlife, but in particular, being able to position vehicles and get into the best location and position for sightings and photography. Which is why I've always concentrated my efforts when doing trips to the Serengeti region on the Ndutu area and on staying south of the national park line in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, because it then affords you that luxury of being able to drive off-road and follow wildlife, which means that you're just always able to have the opportunity to get into the very best positions to not only see whatever it is you want to see, but photograph it. I've certainly done trips that have been further north within the Serengeti ecosystem inside the national park. And while they can be excellent, there's no doubting that I find them at times frustrating because you're not able to leave the road. So you may be looking at something fantastic, but you're having to look at it from 100, 200, 300, 400 meters away because you can't get any closer. That's not the case at Ndutu, where you're able to follow things pretty much wherever they go, or the terrain allows you. Obviously, some parts of the terrain, it's impossible to drive, but generally out on the open plains and when you're driving through the open woodland, it's feasible to drive and follow animals into most places. And of course, that affords you opportunities to just have really intimate encounters. The prides around Ndutu almost invariably have cubs at some age, at one age or another. I've certainly been there when 3 different prides have had cubs of different ages. So finding cubs, particularly when they're young, is always great value and affords you wonderful photographic opportunities. So there's just always that chance of being able to encounter something of interest, and particularly, obviously, lions with cubs are very much something that's sought after on a safari. Even very young cubs, some of the youngest cubs I've ever seen have been in the Ndutu area, cubs that are barely 2.5 months old and have only just really been introduced to the outside world by their mothers. So you get the opportunity, some really young animals, not only lions, but other species as well, as I'll come on to. These cubs were, I think, probably more like 4 or 5 months old when we encountered them, but because they're used to vehicles and so forth, again, you get fantastic opportunities to spend time with them. And that's where your best photographic chances occur, of course, because you can pick and choose and have that luxury of positioning your vehicle in an appropriate place to get the best angles, the best light, and so forth. Here's a proud dad with a young cub. I think this cub was probably 4.5 months old. And of course, you get the opportunity when spending plenty of time with lions to see them doing other things. In Ndutu, they'll often spend time up trees, particularly when it's hot, to get away from heat and flies. And as I've alluded to before, being out first thing affords you opportunities to get the very best light. A typical day in this part of the Serengeti would mean you'd be up certainly by 5:30 and out just before 6. And so you're getting out of the lodge just before the sun starts coming up. So it's still just dark, and the very early sort of wisps of light are just really appearing over the horizon. Then you can be out on the plains. So when the sun actually does break over the horizon, you can be out there and have already got your first subjects in view, or whatever they may be. This again was taken on my last trip last March, April, and we were able to find this particular male lion that was courting a female just before the sun came up. So we were able to maneuver into position to get really nice light as the sun came up. This one too, all about getting the light. You know, any really memorable pictures from Africa are all about getting the light. We've all seen millions of photographs of lions and other African wildlife. So if photography is the primary reason you're going to be there, it's all about being in the right place at the right time when the light is just at its best. This particular male was one that we encountered and followed down Long Gully from just before sunup. So we were there at the right place at the right time when the really beautiful light hit it. This slide is a deliberate segue from lions into cheetahs, which I think are probably the cat for which the Ndutu area is most famous. Short grass plains, great vast open areas are, of course, exactly the habitat that cheetahs prefer and excel in. And without question, Ndutu is the finest area I know in Africa for seeing cheetahs. You probably recognize the lighting here, exactly the same, the very same morning, I think, or if not the same morning, then one shortly before or after that the shot of the lion was taken, we had exactly the same circumstances with this female cheetah. So again, all about being out there at first light to get that wonderful early morning hue and the drama that early morning low raking light brings. But as I was mentioning, without doubt, Ndutu is, I think, the finest place in East Africa for seeing cheetahs. There are so many that often gather in and around the short grass plains area, the Ndutu area, often with cubs, particularly at the time when the wildebeest are in that area, because they're able to hunt so easily on the open plains, not only hunting Thompson's gazelles and Grant's gazelles, their regular prey, but also hunting wildebeest calves. And again, it's all about being out there for beautiful light. I've been fortunate enough to see cheetahs on so many occasions in and around Ndutu. And because you can follow them, again, obviously afforded by the luxury of being able to drive off-road, and I stress at a reasonable distance so you're not causing disturbance. There have been times when the people I've been with, we've made a decision and said, right, we're going to spend the entire day following cheetahs because you have a chance to see them hunt, or at least have an opportunity to see them attempt to hunt. And you could spend 10+ hours out on the open plains following one group of cheetahs or another at distance, moving in closer when the opportunity is appropriate, giving them space when they need to hunt, etc. And it's just a magical experience being able to effectively see a cheetah mum, a coalition of brothers, mum and cubs, whatever it may be, throughout the course of the day, doing what they do. This was a mum with, as you can see, 3 cubs here, very early one morning in Long Gully. And this turned out to be one of the very nicest encounters I've ever had with a mum playing with her reasonably old cubs. We suspected they were probably 6 or 7 months old, these particular cubs. And it's, as I alluded to, probably one of the finest places there is to see cheetahs hunting in the open areas, open plains. This one's hunting a young grouse gazelle, which it successfully actually brought down, as you can see here. And then you get the opportunity, once you've given them space, to move in and actually see them feed. This obviously isn't a grouse gazelle, this is a baby wildebeest, a different kill, where we watched the mother successfully kill the wildebeest from 400, 500, 600 meters away, just to give it plenty of space. But once the kill had been made, it's feasible then to move in to a much closer distance, so you can obviously watch and photograph them actually feeding. And one of the beauties of being able to follow cheetahs over a long period of time throughout the day is that it affords you opportunities to experiment with photography. One of the things I've thoroughly enjoyed doing is actually using one of my old digital cameras that I've had converted to an infrared sensor, which I then use to convert images to black and white. And it's a way of introducing a bit of extra drama into photos. And one of the really nice things from a photography perspective is that you actually often get the very best results during the middle of the day, when the light is very harsh and blue. Not a time that I would normally be taking pictures, because that's really not very pleasing light for color photography. Ordinarily, you're wanting to concentrate photographic efforts at the beginning and the end of the day when the sun is low and the light is raking and warm. But for infrared photography, you often get the very best results during the middle of the day. So it just gives you a sort of another string to your bow. And it has meant I've been able to do sorts of photography and take pictures that I wouldn't have normally taken. I've used it to take motion blur images of wildebeest and of zebra like this. And these were all done with an infrared, a camera converted to an infrared sensor. It's an old camera that effectively was obsolete, but it's been given a new lease of life because I'm able to do this. And it just opens up 1 or 2 extra opportunities. This is in the far southeastern portion of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, overlooking the only active volcano in Tanzania, Oldonyo Lengai, but shortgrass plains where wildebeest often gather, but a very good area for seeing giraffe too. The open plains that I've alluded to are not only good for cheetahs and large herds of grazing animals. At times, they're equally good for elephants that pass through the area, through woodland. And one of the nice things is that if you combine visits to this part of the southern Serengeti with visits to the Ngorongoro crater, which I'll mention in more detail a little later, you often see the same elephants, particularly the male elephants, the bull elephants, that move between the southern Serengeti and the Ngorongoro crater, where they often spend a lot more time. So this particular bull, for instance, obviously a magnificent tusker, was one that we saw in the Ndutu area. But a handful of days prior to that, we'd seen the very same bull in the Ngorongoro crater as well. And he'd moved over 4 or 5 days, a distance of probably 70, 80 kilometers, because he was coming into must and he was on the lookout and was trying to find a female herd and obviously a female to mate with. These open areas are exceptional places for drama, birds, bird photography, bird sightings as well. Here's a griffon vulture on a very famous tree in the shortgrass plains, often called the devil tree because it's sort of so gnarled and twisted. Lappet-faced vultures, very much a feature of these areas as well, particularly when there's lots of carcasses to scavenge. This particular individual was actually building a nest, so carrying in nesting material. Some of the other raptors you may see, banded snake eagle and a long-crested eagle. These are all birds that will move in and out of the open woodland and on the edge of the shortgrass plains. Tawny eagles are seen almost with daily occurrence in this area, particularly when wildebeest herds are around, because again, there's so many carcasses to scavenge. And one of the things I will stress about visiting this part of the Serengeti at the right time is that this is not the experience that you can look forward to. I very much avoid going to this part of the Serengeti in January and February, which, as I alluded to or mentioned, is when virtually all of the wildebeest calves are born, and that's the busiest time to visit this area. And for obvious reasons, you know, there are times when there is a particular sighting that it can get rather silly and there are just too many vehicles. I've always chosen to visit on my own photographic trips at the end of March and into early April, because all of the great masses of tourism disappear. The primary reason for that is that there are a lot of mobile camps are set up in the Ndutu area during January and February, but by early March they've all gone, because once the rains start in earnest in the area, they can't keep them open. So all of the mobile camps disappear, which means there are far, far fewer places to stay, and therefore the numbers of people drop dramatically. So if you visit the Ndutu area in the second half of March and into April, this is not the sort of experience you will get. You're far more likely to get this sort of experience where you have the plains and the wildlife and the herds largely to yourself. And it's well within the realms of possibility that you could spend an entire day out on the shortgrass plains at this time of year, end of March and into April, and not see another vehicle, or the only other vehicle you'll see will be another vehicle associated with your group, and that will be it. And that's obviously one of the great joys, not only as an experience, but as in terms of maximizing good quality photography. It's just unrivaled. And so many people just associate the Serengeti with large numbers of vehicles and so forth, a bit like the Masai Mara. It does not have to be like that. And it's no coincidence that we've chosen to have the Festival of Wildlife next year in April, when we know it's going to be quiet. This is a particular area north of Ndutu called Hidden Valley, which I've chosen to specifically mention because a bit like Long Gully, it's very much an area that often is a magnet and funnel for wildlife, because it holds water after rain for long periods. So if there's been dry periods, animals will funnel in to these areas because water tends to gather. It was an area that until relatively recently was actually within the Serengeti National Park, so you couldn't visit it while staying at Ndutu. The boundaries have now been changed, so Hidden Valley now lies within the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, which is fabulous because it means that you can drive from Ndutu across the plains to this area and visit it and drive around off-road and obviously get wonderful experiences with wildebeest moving through. Here's another motion blur image taken in the Hidden Valley area. Obviously, this sort of thing is a photographic technique that you will get repeated opportunities to do with large herds of wildebeest and other animals as well. This was in Hidden Valley, where there were so many wildebeest on the edge of the lake that the dust was so thick you could barely see the wildebeest. All you could hear was their grunts and their noises and so forth, and you just sort of saw these ethereal shapes moving through this dust cloud, which was in itself spectacular. Hidden Valley, as well as herds of zebra move through, again following the range just like the wildebeest do. So this has really added another string to the bow for any visit to the Ndutu area, because this is such a wonderful magnet. And I'm just going back here to Lake Ndutu, which is very close to the lodge, which I'm going to mention shortly. And there are times, and as you can see, this is a very shallow lake, but when wildebeest are funneling through this part of the Ndutu woodland area, that they'll cross the lake in vast numbers, which can be a real spectacle. And as you can see from this bit of video, you know, there are just vast numbers. This certainly is not something you could ever guarantee. It happens periodically as the herds move through, but it is just one of the things that may or may not happen on any visit to Ndutu. So I've mentioned specifically the Festival of Wildlife at Ndutu next year, 9th to the 19th of April. It will be hosted at Ndutu Safari Lodge, which is without doubt my favorite lodge, frankly, anywhere in Africa. It's a wonderful combination of, it's a privately owned, it's not part of a chain, and it's a wonderful combination of that sort of mobile bush camp type feel, but with those added little conveniences and luxuries that having a small privately run lodge offers. It's in the heart of the bush. There are no fences, so you're right in the thick of it, and wildlife passes through and around here all the time. It's in itself, it's a real magnet for attracting wildlife. Simple rooms, nothing spectacular, nothing overly fancy, but just very comfortable and looking straight out onto the African bush. So you can just sit, when you're not out in the vehicles, just sit in your own veranda or in the communal areas of the lodge, look straight out and be potentially looking at elephants or whatever else there may be, because there are no fences and anything can just come and go as it pleases. It's a very nice, simple lodge, very comfortable and very friendly staff, beautifully run. And as I say, it is my favorite place, certainly in East Africa, if not all of Africa. And as you can see from this, it's just right in the heart of where wildlife just comes and goes. So it's just a really fantastic place to be based for a period of time to explore this part of the southern Serengeti. This shot was taken while I was sitting on one of those seats, just to give you an idea of how close things may come at times. So this wonderful bull elephant was just passing by, and as you can see, there were herds of wildebeest less than 100 meters away from the lodge, and you can see Lake Ndutu in the background there. Being around the lodge gives you an opportunity to look for some of the smaller things that often get overlooked when you're on a safari. Obviously, most safaris mean that you're spending the vast majority of time in a vehicle, but spending time around the lodge gives you opportunities to see things like flat-necked chameleons. That was an adult. This was a juvenile. I think this was one of the shots that Emma took when she was there last year. And leopard tortoises, all of these things you may see certainly when you're out in vehicles, but obviously when you're staying in the bush and in a lodge that's right in the heart, these are things that you could easily encounter at any time. I know Emma spent time looking at some of the things that are less often associated with an East African safari, but in and around the lodge, jumping spiders. And of course, there's plenty of bird life as well. This is von der Decken's hornbill. And these are birds that you'll see on a regular basis in and around the lodge and when out on drives. This is a vitaline masked weaver, woodland kingfisher, and say these are all birds that you would potentially see in and around the lodge on a daily basis. Little bee eater. This is a Takazi sunbird, which visits flowers that are often in bloom in April around the lodge, and scarlet-chested sunbird too. And of course, any safari lodge at the end of the day when there are sundowners has places to sit out, relax. Here's a northern white-crowned shrike coming to scavenge around the campfire. And even after dark, Ndutu is famous for its common genets that live in the roof of the lodge and visit on a daily basis. They're actually fed in the rafters. So these delightful creatures are something that you could look forward to seeing probably on a daily basis while staying at Ndutu. I'm just going to finish off by mentioning one of the optional extensions that's being offered in conjunction with the festival. I think there are, and we'll probably mention when I finish some of the others, but as a pre-tour festival, there will be the chance to visit the famous Ngorongoro crater, which if you've never done so, I would say is well worth considering because it is one of the wildlife wonders. It lies at the southeastern corner of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and it's like a giant bowl that's East Africa in microcosm. Virtually everything you could expect to see on an African safari is potentially visible within this giant bowl that's roughly 20 kilometers across. It's a caldera, so it's a collapsed volcano. And within this, on a daily basis, there are sort of miniature safaris played out. And because obviously this is a place that is so frequently visited, the wildlife is very habituated here, and it means you often get closer to species that are a little more reserved and a little more shy, perhaps elsewhere, need a little more distance, but in the crater, there's often opportunities to get really close to stuff. When you're visiting the crater, you're staying in lodges that are on the crater rim, which is the best part of 600-700 meters above the crater floor. It's very different around the crater rim. It's often dominated by forest, which means the birds are very different. So one of the species that's always looked out for is Shallow's turco. And then down on the crater floor, it's a combination of marsh areas, water that drains down from the rim of the crater where there's often a lot of rainfall, and then drains into the crater, and springs develop and marsh areas develop, which provides habitat for hippos and so forth, where there are pools like this. There are saline lakes where lots of flamingos gather. And then, as you can see, this wonderful wall with acacias behind the crater wall, which provides a backdrop unlike anything else in East Africa. As I alluded to earlier, it's probably the best place, or certainly one of the best places left in East Africa for seeing really big tuskers. Lots of the bull elephants from the greater Serengeti area, when they're not in must and looking for females, gather in the crater, form bachelor herds, and just live in this land of relative plenty. It's not often you see female elephants or youngsters down on the crater floor, because it tends to be dominated by the bulls. The females tend to stay around the crater rim or outside the crater. But the crater floor itself is often one of the best places to get really good encounters with wonderful bull elephants and tuskers. It's also, without doubt, the best place in East Africa to see black rhinos. There's a really healthy population of black rhinos in the crater that are obviously closely guarded and monitored on a daily basis. You are restricted where you can drive in the crater, I do stress that. And there are times, of course, that's frustrating because you have to stay on the prescribed roads and tracks, and sometimes some of the things you might want to see are well away from those tracks. Rhinos in particular can often be quite distant, but with luck you also get a chance to get close views at times of rhinos as they approach some of the roads. Lots of zebra, some of which are resident within the crater, as are wildebeest, but others will come and go in conjunction with migration as well. Fantastic place to see lions. There are resident prides. Last time I was there, I think there were 8 resident prides within the crater itself, using the crater floor and the crater walls. But as I mentioned earlier, there are individuals that will pass in and out of the crater and move over great distances. And one of the lion projects, Copy Lion project, that's based in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, has monitored some amazing movements of lions around the broader system. But it's also a really good place to see lion behavior. This shot was taken on my last trip, March, April last year, where these young lions and a lioness were half-heartedly just really annoying this buffalo. They were just seeing if this male buffalo was injured or so forth, which it wasn't. So they kind of annoyed it and chivied it for 10 or 15 minutes, then lost interest because they realized they really had no chance of actually trying a successful hunt. But of course, seeing a successful hunt is possible. This is a shot Emma took when she was there last April. I think if I remember the story, she watched this particular jackal hunt this injured male Thompson's gazelle for quite a period. I think it was quite harrowing, but was able to witness at close quarters it finally taking it down. Other kills that I've seen successfully are with caracal, which you may see at Ndutu because it's a good place to see caracal, but the crater is also an excellent place to see caracal, and this was one that we watched kill a hare. And it's an excellent place too to see serval. This is one of Emma's pictures. These next two are, and she was lucky enough to see a hunting attempt, although I know she was incredibly frustrated because it was facing away from her. But here's a serval, obviously after a rodent. So that just gives you an idea of one of the optional extensions. Going back to the festival itself, if you're not familiar with the festival concept, it's a little different to a regular wildlife tour. The premise is that it's really a celebration of wildlife and an opportunity to indulge in all aspects of wildlife of the particular area. So Wildlife Worldwide have been organizing festivals for many a year now. And as I say, the premise is that you incorporate not only great wildlife watching in an iconic location, but combine that with all manner of talks and presentations by people who are involved in wildlife in one way, shape or form, whether it be photographers, artists, people working directly in conservation. That's very much a feature of festivals, that we always would pick a local conservation organization to work closely with. People from that organization would be involved and be there to not only impart knowledge, give presentations, but also spend time with anyone on the festival, talking about the work, the important work they're doing within that particular locality. So it's just a great place. This is one of the previous festivals that took place in the northern part of the Serengeti, where we had various Maasai involved, and obviously talking about some of their local culture and customs. These are all things that are indicative of the sort of immersive approach to a festival, that it's not simply about seeing the wildlife, it's about incorporating all other aspects of that particular location. Photography is obviously very much at the heart of any festival. This was obviously taken on one of the previous festivals to the Galapagos. And this was during the festival many years ago to the Pantanal. But photography workshops by professional photographers and people who work in and around photography on a regular basis are very much part and parcel of festivals, as are working with professional artists, whether they be doing sculpting like this particular workshop, or two-dimensional painted art. This is Jonathan Truss, who will be involved in the festival next year, who will be giving demonstrations and workshops. I think this shot was taken on last year's festival to Svalbard that Jonathan was involved with. So the whole concept is that there is something for anyone that's booked the festival to be involved with really every minute of the waking day, whether it be from first light when you're out watching wildlife, the middle of the day when you're back at the lodge, involved in whichever presentation you choose, following whichever interest you may have, whether it be art, two-dimensional art, painting, sculpting, photography, presentations about conservation, etc. There's always something to immerse yourself in. And all festivals finish off generally with an auction that raises funds for the particular conservation organisation that is being worked with for that particular festival. And over the years, I know we've been able to raise tens of thousands of pounds for various conservation organisations, which is obviously has a wonderful feel-good factor, and you really feel like you're contributing to that local area. So here's the team that will be involved in the festival at Ndutu next April. Many of whom, if not all of whom, you're familiar with. Chris Breen, founder of Wildlife Worldwide, Emma, who's obviously hosting this evening, Brett Charman, who works for Wildlife Worldwide, top photographer, myself, Nick Mackman, who's wonderful ceramicist, sculptor, wildlife sculptor, and Jonathan Truss, of course, who many of you know from previous festivals, a larger-than-life character who's always great value on any festival or any trip that he's involved with. So that, I hope, gives you an overview not only of the Southern Serengeti, what's on offer in the Southern Serengeti, the sort of safari you might expect, but also more specifically on the Festival of Wildlife that we've got planned for April next year. I'll hand back over to Em, who will be just hosting the Q&A and the all-important poll. Emma.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. I can't quite tell you how excited I am about going back, and I sort of forget about it, and then I suddenly see these slides and think, oh my God, I can't wait. I mean, it's amazing to see all the images, and, a couple of people have said, oh gosh, it's a lot of photos and it's all about photography. But, I think obviously Nick is a photographer and he's got some lovely images, and it's how we showcase it. But I think the lovely thing about festival is, as he said, it's open to everybody. We're all going to be there enjoying the wildlife. And you can, if you don't want to take part in anything, you don't have to. You can sit on your lovely terrace, watch the elephants or giraffes walking past, and then just go out on the drives. And, there's no pressure to do anything. It's completely up to you how much or how little you take part in things, but you just have the opportunity. We're all there as much or as little as you want to spend time with us, really.
And I think I would add to that anyone's interest is gauged, particular interest is gauged prior to a festival. And when it comes to allocating which vehicles you go out to see wildlife in, you would be put with someone who is appropriate to those interests. So obviously, if your interests are photographic, you would be put with the people who are the keen photographers. If you're more on the artistic side, you'd be put with the artists. And if the conservation aspects are your primary interest, then obviously there would be very much be an emphasis on you being able to spend your time out on the drives with those people. So it's very much tailored as much as is feasible to your particular interests.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's so important. Obviously photographers like to be with other photographers. We can get in each other's ways, nudge each other out of the way, that kind of thing, without being too offended. But I mean, I was in Zambia in November at the same time as Nick Mackman, and we were in a couple of sightings at the same time, and it was fascinating just listening to how she was talking to the clients in the vehicle about the shape of the animals and how to look at things differently. And I think that is just it's a really interesting way of doing it. And even if it's not something that you're used to or that you've ever done before, why not give it a try? It's a nice way to try something new and learn a different skill. And I mean, I've seen people do Nick's sculpture workshops for the first time and come out with the most incredible sculptures that look like they've been doing it for years. So she's obviously a very good teacher. But it's fascinating, and I'm sure Jonathan's exactly the same. I've not seen him in action, but he's such a good character. I believe he's a comedian, isn't he, in his spare time?
Indeed, yes.
It's always going to be good fun with Jonathan. So
I suppose the other thing I would add as well is on my regular trips, not necessarily a festival, but my regular trips to Ndutu, there are often non-photographers that book those trips and very specifically choose them because they know that on a photographic trip, you will be spending time sitting and observing. That's what photographers do, waiting for that right moment. And even if you're not a photographer, but your interests lie in watching the behavior, and rather than zooming around, ticking off one species or another species on some quest, it's about spending quality time with a particular species. So whether you spend 10 hours with a family of cheetah throughout the course of the day, just seeing what they do. So that approach doesn't preclude anyone who's not a photographer. You know, it can appeal to people who aren't photographers simply because it's about indulging in time and maximizing those opportunities to see what animals behave and what they do on a daily basis.
Yeah. So speaking of photography and vehicles, segueing, a couple of the questions have kind of been about that, because I think, you know, from photographers or non-photographers, but how many people are going to be in the vehicles? How's it all going to work with splitting people? You know, if we do have aiming for probably about 40 to 60 people, how are we going to split that between those vehicles? Yeah, let's start with that.
My understanding is that obviously those people who are keen photographers will be put in vehicles where photography will be the emphasis, without a doubt. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the number of people per vehicle has been agreed or tailored to. Most of the safari vehicles, the long wheelbase Land Cruiser types, have 7 seats in, but I don't think we would be putting 7 in. We'd be putting a maximum of 6, I would have thought.
Yeah,
what
we normally
guarantee everyone a window seat.
Exactly. So what we normally would guarantee is a window seat for everybody, but also these vehicles tend to have the open roof. So, you know, if somebody is leaning in one direction and you wanted to avoid it, you can go out the roof and get a view from there. But yeah, generally, I think the standard is 6 maximum, but I think we are looking into potential of, if we have enough vehicles, to offer some for photography with fewer, but bear with us on that one. We'll be able to confirm that closer to the time, but whatever happens, you would have a window at least. There's also another question about beanbags. Just thoughts on kind of if there are beanbags there or on the vehicles. I know a few of them do have, but is it worth bringing one, or would there be?
Definitely. I always use a beanbag. I find them so much more flexible when photographing from a safari vehicle than any other device, and they don't have to be that expensive. Certainly on my own personal trips, we provide beanbags because we've got a stock out there. Obviously, for the festival, there'll be potentially a larger number of people, so my hunch is that may not be possible, but I would certainly recommend anyone who would coming on, well, any trip to East Africa, frankly, but particularly the festival, then if you were to bring a beanbag, you would definitely find it's of significant use.
And I think, and what a lot of people do is often, you know, if they're worried about weight and things, you bring an empty one and just let us know, and we'll just make sure we've got rice or whatever, and we can fill it up. So, you know,
exactly.
if
that's exactly what
concern, then
fill it up with lentils or rice, or sometimes even sand when we're there. So that's not something you need to worry about.
Yeah. Interesting one from Steve, still on photography. What focal length is most useful?
Oh, $64,000 question, of
Isn't
course.
It?
I would say, given the sorts of lenses that are generally available now, 100 to 400, the 200 to 500s, 200 to 600s, anywhere within that sort of range would provide you with the greatest flexibility and usefulness. I have in the past used a prime 600mm lens. I appreciate that lenses like that are very expensive and obviously wouldn't necessarily be something that the vast majority of people would have. But if you're very keen, that sort of lens can be hugely useful. But more flexibility would be a zoom lens, 100 to 400, 200 to 400, or up to 600, something like that. But a lot of sightings, you know, you would be in the 300 to 400 range because you're getting pretty close to things. But obviously, if you're trying to photograph hunting cheetahs, because you have to give them space so they can hunt in a way that they're not going to be disturbed or compromised, those are likely to be more distant during the hunt, and then you get closer shots when the hunt's been successful or otherwise. Bird photography, a lot of the birds are quite small, so you definitely want a 400 mil or above 500 mil. But that sort of thing, you know, one of the zooms, Sigma make, I can't remember what it is. Is it 100 to
It's
600?
150, 600, isn't it?
150, 600. Canon do, is it a 2 to 500 now? Can't quite remember all of the different options, but those sorts of lenses will give you the greatest flexibility, and many of them are effectively a one lens fits all now, which is obviously great for weight as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I think my 300 and a 70 to 200, and both were brilliant, but it was the one of the trips I really kind of felt I was a bit lacking. So I think if you can get a bit more, 4 to 500,
4 to 500,
yeah,
it
gives
be
you just
useful,
a bit more flexibility.
It's not an absolute requisite, but would certainly afford you a greater opportunity, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that's it. I think you've covered everything. No one's got any more questions. I know.
Super.
So I'm going to just launch the poll now quickly, which is basically going to ask you if you'd like a travel plan. I mean, I think Nick's covered most things, but I think all I can say to add, and I mean, he talked about my serval sighting. I spent a good hour in the crater with one serval, and I was pretty much the only vehicle there. One other came up for a while, but I think, you know, the fact that you can visit somewhere with fairly reliable wildlife at a time when, you know, you can be the only vehicle and you can get right up close to the wildlife is just incredible, and it's a magical lodge. So I think, you know, if you're looking for a safari and something a bit different, then do come and join us, because I do think it is a really special trip. As Nick mentioned, there are a couple of extensions that we've got. So we've got a pre-extension to the crater. There's also a walking safari in the Serengeti, which is a really interesting way, goes out near the koppies and you can see really different things. And it's always interesting, I think, when you're doing lots of vehicle safaris, to do a few by foot as well and just see it in a different way. And then we've got some post-tour gorilla treks, some with myself or Brett, and then a gorilla and chimpanzee trip with Nick. So there's lots of different options, and it's, you know, I know a lot of people, if you're going that far, you want to kind of tag something on and make the most of it. So yeah, have a look at those if you are interested. I mean, the trip itself is enough, obviously, and will be epic, but if you do want to add anything on, then it's always an option. So I know some of you are already booked, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. For those who aren't, if you are keen, then there is this special offer code. So if you book using that Zoom code, you get £100 per person off. So that's TZ3Zoom. Email us at sales@wildlifeworldwide.com, or obviously if you get the travel plan through from Sue tomorrow, then you can email back and we'll be in touch. As I said, I absolutely loved it and spent a good week at Ndutu. So if you've got any questions specifically, then do message me. I'm emma.h@wildlifeworldwide.com. Yeah, I think that's probably it. So just to highlight, we've got 2 more talks. I think that's probably it for this series. 2 more talks. We've got Chris when he gets back from Baja, talking about Zambia, his favourite place. And then on the 2nd, Nick is back to talk about Madagascar, also one of his favourite places. So we've got you covered.
Not up there, but to be arranged. There should be one also, we hope, on the 9th of March that Alex Hyde and myself will be doing, talking about photo workshops.
Snuck one in. Love it.
Snuck one in.
Fab. And that'll be a good one for anyone into photography, and for those who aren't into photography. Why not? So all that's left to say is thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much for Nick for walking us through everything so well. Lots of big thank yous from everybody. Really enjoyed the talk by the looks of it. So thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Have a good evening. Bye.